You're listening to the Deerfield Public Library Podcast, August 18th, 2022.
I would almost call it like a simulation of a particular aesthetic gesture, which means I am making that aesthetic gesture, but I'm also like trying to kind of say, oh, what would it be like if I made that?
Right.
That's like the brain teaser of writing this book.
Welcome to the Deerfield Public Library Podcast, where we interview authors, artists, and other notable people from our suburb of Deerfield, from Chicagoland, and around the world. I'm Dylan Zavagno, the Adult Services Coordinator at the library. Our guest, Gabriel Ojeda-Sagué, is a poet and writer living in Chicago, and he was one of our Queer Poem a Day poets this year. I'm thrilled to present this enthusiastic conversation about his amazing book, Madness, from Nightboat Books. Gabriel is also the author of Losing Miami, that was out in 2019 from The Accomplices, and is currently a PhD student in English at the University of Chicago, where he works in the study of sexuality. We'll jump right into our talk, but I wanted to give just a little bit of context. Madness, as you'll soon hear, is an imagined, selected poems by a fictional poet named Luis Montes-Torres, complete with introductions, a selection of diaries that we'll refer to, and, of course, poems. We also spend some time talking about Gabriel's 2020 book, An Excess of Quiet, selected sketches by Gustavo Ojeda, 1979 to 1989, from Sober's Cove Press, which features the work of Gabriel's uncle, Gustavo Ojeda, who was a painter in the New York City 80s scene and exhibited with people like Keith Haring and David Wojnarowicz. I had an amazing time talking to Gabriel. We go in depth on what makes Madness work, and I think I mean that in all senses. And we talk about how his real project on his uncle's sketches relates to his fictional project. We also share our obsession with the poet John Ashbery, and lots more. Let's get right into it. Here's our conversation. My guest is Gabriel Ojeda-Sagué, the author of 4 books of poetry, most recently Madness, which came out in March 2022 from Nightboat Books. It's one of my favorite books I read this year. It did something to me very overwhelming that I don't really know how to talk about, and I hope we can try because it reminded me why I love poetry, but really why I love being disoriented by poetry. I've done this podcast for over 5 years. I try to be really prepared. I think I've read your book more times in preparation. So I'm just going to describe it briefly, and you can pick it up from here. But so Madness purports to be selected poems of Luis Montes-Torres, born 1976, died in 2035. And there are introductions. It's like the selected poems. So there's introductions to each section. And I think I read it like at least 10 times. Sometimes I would read it straight through. Sometimes the introductions would seem like poems themselves. Sometimes I would not read the introductions and just read the poems to try to like pull Luis away from the editors, even though I know that you created it all. And I want to get your response to all of that, but also just ask you about creating a fictional poet, because there are many favorite fictional poets. I have John Shade from Nabokov's Pale Fire or Pessoa's Heteronyms. I think they're amazing maybe because they're fictional.
Yeah, so that's a good summary of the book. I also have to say I'm very enamored that you read it as many times as you did and all the nice things you've said about it. So the book starts from the convergence of a few things in my life. The first is the corniest, which is I was proposing to my now husband around the time of, let's say, 2017, 18. And so I was like very in love and all that stuff. And so I started writing these love poems just because it was the sort of thing circulating in my life. At the same time, I was also reading a lot of selected poems. Namely, I was reading some things that I remember at least. I was reading the Bernadette Mayer Reader. I was reading the Alfred Starr Hamilton selected that came out from the Song Cave around that time. I was also reading Reynaldo Arenas' Selected from, honestly, like the early 2000s. And so I was reading a lot of these, and I was just getting really interested in the form. A kind of funny little anecdote about that is I was reading a Schuyler Uncollected, and at the back of the book, they had a little bio for James Schuyler, and it said something like, James Schuyler was born in 19 da-da-da, he won the Pulitzer Prize in 19 da-da-da, and he died in 19 da-da-da. And I was just like obsessed with this really short, kind of dark summary of a person's life where all they do is like, they're born, they win the Pulitzer, and then they die. Like, I just thought that kind of compression was very funny to me. I got it from an industry standard. I mean, we write these bio blurbs all the time, but I was really interested in the Selected's need to kind of compress a person's life, highlight particular things that would be of interest to maybe a literary historian or a fan or somebody who wanted to get a sense of the life. And so it's a form that highlights particular things and lowlights others. I was intrigued by this. Third thing happening in around this time is that I'm working on what would become An Excess of Quiet, which is a selected sketches of my uncle, of my uncle's work, I should say. So my uncle, Gustavo Ojeda, died in 1989 before I was born, and he was an artist in New York. He died from AIDS complications, and he left behind a lot of work that, to make a long story short, that after he passed away, didn't continue in circulation. And so I've put it on myself as a project to kind of bring back the circulation it once had in the New York 80s. And so I was looking at a lot of his archives, and I was scanning through his sketchbooks, like 10,000 pages of sketchbooks that I was scanning sort of surreptitiously at the University of Pennsylvania libraries. And so I was dealing a lot with, this person's archive. So, okay, these three things are happening, and I basically get the idea as I'm writing these love poems that maybe it would be interesting, maybe more interesting than what I was doing, to think of the poems as coming from someone else. So these poems didn't originate with Luis, but they started, and this is the section that is called All the Love Bush in Madness. They started as love poems that I was just writing for myself, and I kind of wanted to get away from their sincerity by putting one layer of distance where I said, what would it be like to write a poem about a person who says, I love you, instead of just a poem that says, I love you, or something like that. So that distance became really interesting to me. And once I had that, I just started to think, well, who would that person be? What would a continued interest in that become? And I formulated this idea for a fake Selected, and it went from there. Also, right then I moved to Chicago. That's what happens in my life.
Why don't we start with reading one of those love poems?
Sure.
Why don't you choose one from that section?
Sure. Here's the title poem, which is called All the Love Bush, title to the section. And it's one of the earliest ones I wrote. And for a long time did not think of it as part of the project, but then it sort of coalesced. All the love bush, I pretend your galaxy, mine. But we found the backside of homemaking, made a trail and followed it. We said, weave this pink antibiotic air into a bush, float there on me. Inside, there's a play we watch, women singing songs. There is an eagle in my eye, there's someone to talk to. There is the place where your hand draws weather. It's simple, you said. A cloud, you got one. I'm not fearing light today. I'm covered in it. And the book I dreamed of, I wrote. My gathering of fruit sending songs enough to follow a plot. This evening, Mercury Nursery will send me a poem I won't hide. Take over from here. Set me down under our squeaking ceiling fan. If you hear guitar notes, wave the actually away from both of us.
So when I think back to some of your earlier books or chapbooks, you have an interest in investigating, I think you called it in an interview, media we tend to shrug off. And so you have a book, Jazzercise is a Language, that is about jazzercise. It's wonderful. But you also have chapbooks on Zelda or Cher's Twitter feed or The Joy of Gay Sex, the old book from the 70s co-written with Edmund White. Because you mentioned wanting to distance yourself from love poetry, I also was wondering if just the turn towards like books or selected poems as a medium was a kind of way of investigating a medium we shrug off, because either poetry in general is shrugged off or specifically selected, or was this more of a tribute to this more kind of austere, respected medium?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think when I was younger and was doing projects like Jazzercise, the Share book, things like that, I was really interested in kind of this marginalized media thing and kind of playing with that. And actually in my academic life, because I'm a PhD student for money, not very much, but for some money, I study pornography and the history of pornography. So I'm always interested in this kind of thing. I think as a poet, that started to open up with writing Losing Miami into a kind of more general interest in form and what particular forms do. So one might say it's a kind of interest in mediation writ large. And so I think Madness, it does a bit return to that sense of mimicking and also exploring a particular medium that has a particular cultural place. This time, a selected poems is not exactly a denigrated form, nor is it like a high form. It's kind of a, you don't know a lot about this person and you need a primer. It's sort of like it can be the first thing you read of a person. So for me, that's like not exactly the experts kind of form, but it's a sort of, it's like a primer form. And so what I was interested in doing is kind of like taking and exploiting the aesthetic possibilities of that form that we take for granted or that we use to achieve another thing, say give you an introduction to William Carlos Williams or whoever you're reading a selected of. In my case, I wanted to sort of see what it did if I came at it from this fictional standpoint where the thing you're getting an introduction to does not exist beyond the form that is in front of you. So yeah, I think it kind of circles back a little bit, actually. I hadn't really thought of that until you put it that way.
Well, I think that what I want to begin to investigate here is that the form of poetry itself has some trapdoors in it. And that
Totally.
I think we're going to find some of those trapdoors. So I would love to maybe have you read from the introduction, but before you do, because you mentioned the Schuyler biography, I found this from an introduction to Pessoa poems by, is it Alberto Cairo, however you say that. Mm-hmm. Here's a poem from his made-up poet. If, after I die, someone should choose to write my biography, nothing could be simpler. There are only two dates, that of my birth and that of my death. Between one and the other, all the days were mine.
Fabulous.
So whose poetry is this? Whose biography is this? That all gets blurred in any work of poems, but especially, I think, in yours. I was thinking maybe you could just read maybe the first few paragraphs from the very first introduction in Madness.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
And I would call this a poem.
I think I would too. I mean, for me, this is like, this is totally one of those books that would get marketed as like a hybrid form or whatever, because it has prose, quite a lot of prose throughout it. But yeah, for me, this feels like a collection of poetry. I don't know, maybe it's just because that's all I've written, but that feels right to me. So this is the very first introduction, which is like nominally written by two editors, Javier de las Palmas and Angel de la Escoba, who I just sort of imagine as like, I don't know, young grad student-y types. Luis Montes-Torres was like a knot in a muscle. Luis Montes-Torres was like a hole in fabric. Both seem to be true. An always active, hardened node straining towards something that isn't there, or a little negative, an unwoven dot made by threads moving too far from each other, or by some foreign object pushing its way through. He was a boring fire. This is the first selection of his poems, published 20 years after his death in 2035. It was a question about immigrant environmentalisms posed to us by a mentor and comrade of ours that led us back to Montes-Torres' poetry. Do they work? Do they work? To Ángel, this meant, do they affect change in the world? Do they reverberate? To Javier, this meant, do they coalesce together? Do they gel into anything like a philosophy? A prior research collaboration of ours on multilingual protest poetics brought Montes-Torres into our footnotes as a negative, one example among many of Cuban-American poets writing exclusively in English. But we remembered later, on brainstorming how to wrap our heads around this question, the uneven breadth of Montes-Torres' work, the gestures and confusions he seemed to set out for us towards these issues and more. We knew that his work seemed to know something useful, though it was unclear what exactly. And so began our long, new relationship to a minor poet, one who briefly reached notoriety on being shortlisted for the National Book Award and on winning the Lambda Literary Award for his collection, The Ocean as It Shouldn't Be, but who went almost entirely disregarded by the end of his life. As we moved through what we could find of his work, we noticed a pattern. Each piece of Montes-Torres' career that we encountered seemed disconnected from the others, each book uncomfortable with its place in his body of work, each critic of his only able to hold one book or one poem or one theme to analysis at a time. Our job, as we began to see it, was to be connective tissue. We decided, perhaps out of frustration, perhaps out of faith that there was indeed something there, to take on the task of organizing what we could find, of making for Montes-Torres a document that would turn this scatter into a line. This book is the result.
And then I thought maybe you could just read the first two poems from the first collection, Hills and Towers, which, as the editor's note, is an English translation of Montes-Torres.
Yes. Yeah, so this is a very young Montes-Torres, his first real project at all. Here's two poems. This first one is called Learning. In the drainage basin, how to separate my ideas from each other. It's some difference between rain and small ponds falling, just to ruin my clothes, to collect into each other, a hand on a path towards something perfect. There is a bush with a small model of the world confined between leaves. The watershed turns inside out, something I'll have to remember. I put a pencil on the river and draw at a source. And this is the title poem, Hills and Towers. And the smaller blessings they reconfigure, laid bare and even in front of them. It could be thought by a passerby that the distance is a nightmare, but it is always worth the trek, making yourself glimmer just to get smaller in that green and shadowed screen. It is always worth it to walk straight into the background and open your mouth.
So I think listeners won't quite hear all of the echoes to other poems, but what's amazing to me about this is that these are designed to be poems that they sound like young poems, but they're also speaking about being first poems and about announcing yourself. And the poet is saying it is always worth it to make the trek and to, glimmer just to get smaller. I think it's the greatest achievement of this book is just the range of styles and how you understand how an artist kind of progresses and has different obsessions throughout their life and experiments or builds, but then also has all of these forces they're subject to, market forces and history, accidents of life and identity. Were these also intended to speak to the larger project? Because sometimes I would be reading them and the language would be, it felt like I was hallucinating because it would be like speaking about just the whole process of trying to contain this huge work and all these styles together at once.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think when the book is successful, it's trying to work at kind of three levels, which is, say, the most biographical level, say that the poem refers to events or affects that might be described as Luis's, whoever that creature is. At a second level, there's something about the poem working for the book as an aesthetic object, sort of placing something in relation to a later point in time in the book that Luis wouldn't have known about because in the fiction he's young and he'll get older later. So the fact that this poem sort of bounces off of later poems thinking about water, that's not exactly to the fiction biography, but that's something that works on the book level. And then there's this third sort of meta level about where the poems reflect on their own status in a larger meta-poetic project, which is a fictional selected poems. So the start was hard. I mean, so the Hills and Towers was the second section that I wrote after All the Love Bush because I knew that if I was going to encounter this project, I'd need a place to start. And so I started at the beginning. And basically I thought, I want something that feels slightly sloppy, right? Like something that feels, okay, this person doesn't have, some super sharp, like very forceful, very studied architecture to the poems yet. I want something that feels like, I'm making this because I feel that I need to make it and it's just going to happen. And I looked a lot sort of to the style of like somebody like Eileen Miles, who has a very like, I think falsely unpolished style, right? Like it contains the appearance of being unpolished. And I tried kind of adopting that style to give that same sense that something is budding here, but hasn't yet found all the tools it will need. And so it worked for me to have these kind of short, very breathless poems with very little punctuation that just move really quickly, almost like these little first spurts of breath. And this is basically that's one example of the concern for each of these books, which was like thinking about, okay, what would be happening aesthetically for this person at this stage in their life? What would the interests be? And I think for, almost any of the books, I could tell you a sort of like the things that I'm thinking about or the reference points that I'm thinking about. And the hardest task, I would say, after kind of writing poems that were like, that had a little bit of a semblance of bad, it's like you don't want to write bad poems because nobody wants to read those, but you want to write something that feels like a person's first book, was the other side of it, which was the sort of last poems, the last book, the last poems. So in that, I was thinking a lot about somebody like Adorno's sense of late style, which for him is like the kinds of concerns that an artist comes to aesthetically when death seems like a near possibility, which Luis in those last poems is relatively young still and probably isn't thinking about death. So they're not like death poems, but there's a sense of, how would I put this? Almost like an aesthetic refinement that doesn't look like a maximalism. Like it's not an attempt at writing poems that are architecturally ornate and big and really technical and showing off everything I've done so far. It's actually an almost like a reduction of what I need to do to put forward an aesthetic proposal. So the last book, Some Shields, gets almost smaller. The poems look a lot like the poems in Hills and Towers. They kind of reduce a little bit. In that sense, the book has a maybe somewhat too clever attempt at kind of being like circular, like that it starts in this little thing and crescendos up and then diminuendos down and re-begins. But yeah, so I was always trying to, I would almost call it like a simulation of a particular aesthetic gesture, which means I am making that aesthetic gesture, but I'm also like trying to kind of say, oh, what would it be like if I made that?
Right.
That's like the brain teaser of writing this book, which made it take a lot longer than the earlier books, I guess, for me.
Yeah, well, and it's both so fun. I mean, that's why like some of my readings, I would be so focused on the editors because it was like maybe the more intellectual fun side of it. But then there is this like, when I would just read the poems, I would start to see these themes that like Luis is a very obscure poet. He's a library worker like me. And I know you took his biography from some different people like Reynaldo Arenas. He came over on the Mariel boat lift from Cuba. Alfred Starr Hamilton, he's sort of, had one book of poems published in his lifetime. And there's kind of one book here that Luis gets attention for. But then I would start to read, so I'll just read a few lines. This is from one of the poems in that first collection, Hills and Towers, just, I don't like being here, so I won't. And then in the next collection, a slightly different style, now we're double-spaced. Your job is to draw an outline to a kingdom and to be somewhere in its muddle populace, maybe a clue, a twist, but certainly a stone, a description. Don't let this be so simple, a thin atmosphere of cologne. A star someday will be resting unopened on the table. It can be cracked by a hammer and made ordinary. I guess I'm wondering, it seemed like Luis was a person who wanted to escape the world.
Yes. Totally.
Very much.
Yeah.
And he has an uneasiness with the world. I think that's a feature of queer literature, immigrant literature, right? But those are not, that marginal voice is central to poetry. Mm-hmm. And I guess I wanted to ask you in general, having brought all of this up, just about your sympathies. Why are you attracted to somebody who is this obscure artist?
Totally. I think there's a few questions there, and so I want to try to hit a few of them. The first is about let me say something about this relationship to the world. So one of the things that is the madness of the book is that Luis is a person who is as deeply attached to the world as he is craving escape from it. That those two, affective senses of the world not only waver between each other, but sometimes exist at the exact same time. One sort of thing that reminds me of, or that puts me in mind of, is suicidality, right? Or let's say suicidal ideation is another way of putting that. And I wanted a book where, this is a book very much about mental health, but I didn't want suicide to appear in it as a term used, employed, and actually considered. I wanted it to sort of appear as the possible implication of a continued relationship to things around. So one of the things that the diary does is shows how much deep investment Luis has in particular things in the world. I mean, he loves the ocean. He loves his boyfriend. He loves his dog. He loves looking at the natural. But so many things in his life don't work, and he kind of can't seem to make things work for himself, at least not in the way he desires. And the madness, one of the things that the madness is that continual pressure. And I thought it'd just be more interesting for the book for Luis to just go on rather than actually, enact some kind of getting away from the world, just sort of continue. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I heard in your question was about the story's allegiances to particular kinds of figures. So one of the people, or two of the people, I guess, that the biography is mixing up are my father and uncle, who were both Cuban exiles, not Mariel exiles, but rather the first generation, sort of 60s exiles. And I was really interested, and have always been very interested, in the way they came into the world. They both went to high school in Fairfax, Virginia, which I mentioned because Luis goes to high school in Fairfax, Virginia. My uncle was an artist who died early, as I said, and I was sort of interested in some of his own diaries that I've read. And so their stories, and the stories of those two people in the United States creating some kind of life, were a big point of interest for me. I was also interested in people like Roberto Harrison, Raquel Salas Rivera, a lot of immigrants who are trying to sort of make something happen in the U.S. I have this theory, and it's going to sound cockamamie, and we don't have time to get into it, but I have this theory that, so I'm a person who has OCD, and I live with that, and I have this sort of theory that like something about the American social political world sort of made that happen. Like I don't necessarily, like, yes, I think it's biological and all that, and I take meds, and the meds are great. Thanks, Lexapro. But also, I think that we live in a particular society that creates anxiety. I think American society is anxiety producing. I think it's obsession producing, and I wanted to do that. And I think an immigrant figure, sort of made sense to me as somebody who comes from a family of immigrants. Then the other one is the poet, like who most of us make very little money. Most of us get no publicity. Most of us just put things out in editions of, 200 or whatever. This is very much, Luis is like, he's a small press poet, like I have been, like many of my friends and many of the people I read and care about have been. And part of that is actually like sort of celebrating and relishing the unique intimacies that publishing environment brings up, and also complaining about the fact that it sucks. Like, I remember when I was talking with Nightboat editors about some of the poetry economic parts of this book, they were like, you sound sort of, frustrated by these kinds of like editions of 300 and the, one review and the this, that, and the other kind of environment of poetry. And I was like, yeah, I am frustrated by it. Like
Right.
I do it. I love it. I would rather the sort of small press world over, I don't know, the Simon & Schuster world, though. Hey, if you're listening, Simon & Schuster, hit me up. But there is something kind of brutal about it. So I wanted to kind of dive into that. I think something about really sinking my teeth into the selected form brought up for me like all the publishing hassles I've dealt with, or the publishing world that seems to be.
So can I ask you about, sorry to interrupt you, but I must ask you about, so first of all, I believe I've heard that one of the treatments for OCD is imagining the worst case scenario, which is what you do over and over in this book. And there is a section where there's Luis Montes-Torres' one-hit book, The Ocean as It Shouldn't Be, and he's he wins the Lambda Literary Award. And the editors are very aware, as you are aware, that the more conventional poetry and the poems that are more explicitly about identity sell better.
Yeah.
And I wondered how much that was a comment on Losing Miami, perhaps, or any of the other expectations that people might have about your work or how it's received.
Oh, it totally is. I mean, I think not so much about Losing Miami. Maybe I'm about to take that back. But so The Ocean as It Shouldn't Be is framed in the book as kind of bad. Or rather that it can't quite figure out if it's a parody of something or a really sincere relishing in that thing, which we might call a kind of like Latino immigrant identity poetics. I won't start naming examples of this because I think that might offend. But so I was kind of interested in like, I am a writer who is really not interested in the sort of sincere aesthetic packaging of my identity as a particular poetic instance. I like to write about my identity, actually. I for the most part do. But I really like to take it in these sort of sideways or diagonal directions. So Losing Miami is a good example of, I think, my counter to identity poetics, which is that it's all about identity, but I'm trying to really abstract and really displace some of the terms of that. And one thing I was really interested in that book is the tradition of kind of bilingual poetics by Latinos in the U.S. And my like example here is sort of something, I don't know, something that would be like, my abuela makes me arroz while we sit and talk of soledad, or what, something that I find very corny. So in like a similar parody of that kind of poetics would be something like the Abuelita poem by Paul Martinez Pompa, who is here in Chicago. And I was just interested in like what you can do by playing with that. And so what Losing Miami does is it really shakes what a bilingual poetics would look like. So one of the sections has like each word is switching language. So one word in Spanish, one word in English, one word in Spanish. And then it also has this kind of, I would say, let's say rebellious appendix that gives translations of poems, but just kind of reverses some of the polarities of their language play so that it's not actually that helpful to
Right.
understanding if what you're looking for is comprehension. So anyway, so Losing Miami is me already engaging with this tradition in a particular way. The Ocean as It Shouldn't Be is an attempt at kind of like entering it and writing something that feels a bit more, I don't know, mainstream and kind of classic and consumable. But I didn't want to just do a parody. I felt like it would be like a weird sort of like mean-spirited random section of the book that wouldn't gel with everything. And so I was like, this has to be like, it has to be kind of pretending it's satirizing, but from inside of the satire, like actually really wanting something to work for it or something.
Yeah.
It's almost like if you were like, I don't know, impersonating somebody who you actually really deeply admired, but you're like trying to cut them down because you won't say that you admire them or something. So that book was tough because it just is tonally really unstable.
Can we hear a poem from it?
Yeah, sure.
And I just wanted to say, too, that my response was also to kind of want to prove the editors wrong because they're a little dismissive.
Yes.
And I did sort of feel like, oh, they're being sort of mean or antagonistic, and that there is something interesting about this poetry that I want to hold up, and that poems are so private that even editors designed for them are not quite getting them right.
Yes, that's true. So I think this would be a good one. This is called Of Record. So this book, I should just say, is very much about this book section, this fictional book, is very much about the Mariel boat lift itself, and about sort of landing, so to speak. So this is called Of Record. What is of record is the heat as we already know it, the several silent moments between us as the water swings lower than it should, as if we were meant to sink without drowning. What is of record is the ocean as it shouldn't be, but is an adhesive road towards a puzzle box. This ossified cabinet stuffed with misfired desire can be received into data. Baba answers where we are with here, and he's exactly right, though he is setting us aside. Land us, and you will see a transformation into allotropy.
So I want to take a bit of a left turn here.
Yeah, do it.
You and I both love John Ashbery.
We do, it's true.
And particularly his book, 3 Poems.
Yes.
Which is a deeply disorienting series of mostly prose poems. They're kind of lectures, sometimes I think, on what is possible in poetry and art and life. You told me that you kind of get the sense you were reading philosophy, but maybe like the flavor of philosophy, but without like the meaning.
The tone.
Right.
Yeah, but you almost can't follow it in the way you would philosophy.
Okay, I have just a small excerpt that I think gives a little taste of it. One is aware of it as an open field of narrative possibilities, not in the edifying sense of the tales of the past that we are still, however, chained to, but as stories that tell only of themselves, so that one realizes one's self has dwindled and now at last vanished in the diamond light of pure speculation. Collar up, you are lighter than air. So
good. It's so good.
It's amazing. And so when I'm reading something like that, I would start to be like, well, I actually really do have some attachments to these abstract words like self or open field. And they're being used so abstractly that I don't know if we're being further imprisoned or being more released.
Totally.
And then in the next sentence, the rug is going to be pulled out for us. So it's sort of this huge question for people interested in John Ashbery. How are you going to be influenced by him? Because some people are going to try to imitate him. But I think you found this really beautiful way through all of these distancing techniques. And there's a section, a couple sections, which I think are my favorite in the book, that do this kind of like totally abstracted poetry, but we still have this surrounding of this knowingly fake biography. So it puts it, I think, in this same experiential place for me where I don't quite know if the connections I'm making to meaning are right, and that makes it all the more beautiful to me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, Ashbery is such a big influence for me. It's hard, right? Like, people sort of famously think of him as having a lot of imitators, so you want to be sort of careful with what you do with him. So the three poems, what I really admire in that book is just how hypnotic it is. It's sort of like, if you just keep reading it, you're smart for excerpting it, but it's so hard to excerpt, right? Because it's just massive. And the more you read it, you just get into this kind of like, a distance from the meaning of the text that almost becomes kind of zen. Like, I always think, like, that first sentence you wrote is, one is aware of it as an open field of narrative possibilities. Like, right, that sounds like something that, I don't know, like Bakhtin could say about, the dialogic or something like that. Like, it sounds like it's appropriating kind of the language of a philosophy or a criticism or something, but you have no idea what the it is, and you're never going to get a sense of what the it is. And then very quickly the terms will all shift in a way that you're like, wait, where was I? What was I doing? And so there's almost like this feeling of like constantly sort of waking up and sort of falling asleep and waking up. That I love in Ashbery, that kind of hypnosis. Now, I don't think that I attempt to recreate that feeling, though I'm really interested in that affective possibility, which I think comes from his grammar. And so I was interested in like kind of Ashbery's grammar, and I think there's definitely certain poems that are taking cues from how he thinks about sort of like sentence construction. And then I was also really interested in the way Ashbery talks about the day. Like, the Madness is a book very much about the day. Like, it's a term that comes up a lot, passing the days, passing time, or what is it in a day. And I think Ashbery's really good at that because he's kind of like a phenomenologist. He's sort of thinking about like the particulars of experience. And I think that was something that I got out of him.
So I want to have you read from Dictation. And this is, now we are actually in the future beyond our present. We've zoomed into, when does this book come out? Dictation is published in 2024.
Yes.
And as the editors note, the climate crisis has really ramped up, and that these poems are, in their view, a response to that. I thought I would have you read, and I don't even know why, but it makes me cry every time I read it. The poem that starts, "If I put my hands in water," and maybe you could just then read to the end of Dictation, the next 2 pages as well.
Sounds good. If I put my hands in water, if I put your hands in tar. If I put my hands in water, if I put your hands in tar. If I put my hands in water, if I put your hands in tar. If I put my hands in water, if I put your hands in tar. If I put my hands in water, if I put your hands in tar. If I put my hands in water, if I put your hands in tar. If I put my hands in water, if I put your hands in tar. If I put my hands in water, if I put your hands in tar. If I put my hands in water, if I put your hands in tar. If I put my hands in water, if I put your hands in tar. If I put my hands in water, if I put your hands in tar. If I put my hands in water, if I put your hands in tar. If I put my hands in water, if I put your hands in tar. Changing color of water in response to the introduction of chemicals, an imprecise dictation, unproven, obsessed with smoke over the city. Changing weight of water in response to the introduction of weight, an imprecise dictation, unproven, obsessed with smoke over the city. Churning between marble pillars, water responding to its weight, an imprecise dictation, unproven, obsessed with smoke over the city. Separation is impossible in response to chemicals, to weight, an imprecise dictation, unproven, obsessed with smoke over the city. I see spots in my vision, lead and ice, tar and cream, awful weight, an imprecise dictation, unproven, obsessed with smoke over the city. Something clear gaining color in response to the introduction of chemicals, reddening, unproven, obsessed with smoke over the city. One of the influences for that poem is the work of Stephen Ratcliffe, who has this massive, kind of unreadable book that is him looking at the sky every day and writing really, really similar little poems about the sky where just slight things change. So, instead of saying like the purple lines, it will say the blue lines, but everything else is the same. Like these really micro variations. I think the book is like 500 pages long. It's like meant to be one of these kind of unreadable tomes. But I really liked that gesture, and I just thought that something about adopting that and applying it rather to something very kind of chemical and technical would have a nice effect here.
Well, and it is hypnotic. I mean, it literally is. I want to get to talking about your uncle's sketches, but I thought maybe as a transition, we would just have you read one of the longer poems in the book, which is one of my favorites. So this is from Hold Me to It, because, of course, this imagines that we're only getting part of the book. And I have to say, I would get so mad at the editors. I'd say, well, I just want the whole poem.
It's funny. I like that response. I mean, I've had that response from people. A friend of mine, Eric Sneathan, once said like, "Oh, I would read the whole book of Hold Me to It," and I almost clarify in a way like, this really is all I wrote. Like this is the only thing that exists, but it does have that nice illusion. So this is from Hold Me to It. Infrastructure has little capacity for promise-making, as we have all now learned, though steadiness is its first and only appeal. The idea is freckling on second consideration, a bad reflection as it always really was, of the logical results of what we set out to do. Do not fantasize about Atlantis, buried treasure, when you were so baldly lied to, about what you could set your mind to and disperse. A better version of a lily pad is encoded in the current version of the lily pad. Return of the ice, fingers shaped into a gun, the autumn of a philosopher, stuck. Be sure to watch the species in the other screen, where colors are brighter and harder to track. I go where I go, you rob me of my balance. In a feature of August, the temptation is to fear the heat that leads a melody, but in no way is this behavior truly sane. You cannot sleep with your head against a thesaurus when the promise made was against variation in the name of something dressed as innovation, which we now see as dishonest. Faulty patterning. In laying out where an object began and another object ended, the promise reduced each object to its lifespan. It circulated the bad news. It said to be eager with your mind and its silhouette. It saw pleasure as exhaustion's ricochet. It planted plants. You hear that like I do, mosquitoes passing by your ear. You hear that like I do, a third color made in reference to two others set up just behind the stage. Everything about the golf course. The end of all these minor acts within the diamond, if that is how you would like to think of it. But these are the returns. The return to death, the conversation of all animals in this new form of intimacy with our thoughts. Of course, water returns and reshelves. I am handing out microscopic fires, something you could silence with the pinch of two fingers. An island taken from its context, skin peeled from a snake, is a thin thing pulled apart by storms. Nothing could keep that word. Sun, if it careens, permit me to desire. Who is watching you as you run through the woods, dirt scraping your thighs as they rush and sweat, the taste of cocoa remaining just between your molars? You invent a half-lion, half-girl to rid you of this flu, which is, in every case, a futile effort. A dream from the head of St. Eustace. The promise absolved you of your genuine paranoia, pretended that it was a system of roads. You finally let the firefly out of your hand. You watch as a friend makes a deep burn in his arm, a promise that I still love you. A world where the lily pad does not exist is programmed into the current version of the lily pad. There is so much discussion around the behavior of the lie. This time, there is no thought of each other. Or there's only thought of each other, our holding here a honeybee as a forest burns, or the frightening moments when we think the same thing. The promise is that all your senses are harvesters. The milder anxieties will do you little good now. though they are unrelenting in their small, constant need, as we are chest-deep in purchased horror. I think singing to myself will guarantee me a next thought, though it barely does. You speak as if to fill this room with sound. You barely fit into your clothes. 2 mulch pieces rubbed together will not start a fire. A lithograph of a clover. Here and then I borrow your loneliness as we watch the earth bite its lip and die. This is what it can make of itself. It bears its limit to you. In sweetness pulled from a thorn, the difference between belong and belong in its least optimistic capacity. Every steady and silver hand-holding, an incomplete remark made on a bad bet. Except in loving you, I stupidly hope. Or except in taking a ruler to the ground. When the stove is lit, when I promise you anything, hold me to it.
Okay. So I think that's brilliant.
Thank you.
am really obsessed with, in laying out where an object began and another object ended, the promise reduced each object to its lifespan. It circulated the bad news. And I think, well, of course, the editors say, and we can clearly hear how this poem is about climate change and the lies that institutions told about it, and that this poet is wanting us to hold him to the promise, even though he's fake. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you about your real uncle. Yeah. Because he does have drawings and paintings that blur objects between each other, right?
This is true, yes.
And one of the unbelievable things, so the book, this other book, which we will add to the library collection, An Excess of Quiet, Selected Sketches by Gustavo Ojeda, 1979 to 1989. You write the introduction to it. This is a real introduction that you're writing. And
yeah, it's funny. I was like I think I had finished writing Madness when I wrote that introduction, but it was like the 2 introductions I was writing that like given year or whatever, one's for a person who doesn't exist and one is my uncle. It's a sort of funny thing.
And you write in the introduction to your uncle how his work was perceived. Mm-hmm. And it's often in these very contradictory responses that seemed like they could apply to Luis Montes-Torres. So I wrote down a few from your introduction, or these binary tensions that you say are raised between the real and imaginary, the ordinary and supernatural, the quiet and the loud, the formal and the amateurishly sentimental. You also said in the introduction that you thought one of his paintings was going to eat you as a child. So can you just tell us a little bit more about your uncle and this project, and then maybe in what ways you think it might relate to Madness?
Totally. Yeah, so Gus was a New York-based artist. He studied at Parsons and then lived there until he died in 1989. And what he was most known for were these urban nightscapes, so paintings of cities at night. And from a technical standpoint, a lot of people sort of praised him for a real capacity of representing light and the lack thereof. So he was really interested in kind of controlling the light in these urban nightscapes. What was interesting to me, I mean, because the thing is, I grew up with a lot of these paintings because the sort of not so interesting biographical story is basically once he dies, there's like a retrospective in the immediate year after his death, but a lot of stuff falls out of circulation pretty quickly. The exhibition world doesn't keep up with him. This is the height of the AIDS crisis, so there's a lot happening in the art world, a totally unstable time. So a lot of the art comes into the hands of a person who I would also call my uncle, but for ease of understanding was Gus's longtime life partner, and my grandparents, my uncle's parents. So I grew up with a lot of these paintings. I grew up around a lot of these paintings, and I thought they had this real intensity to them because even though they're these kind of dark, sort of meditative, kind of Zen paintings of buildings at night, there's some kind of like flaring sort of intensity under them. And the critics who were into his work when he was alive kind of say the same thing, that it looks really ordinary and zen and kind of like, oh, yep, it's a New York buildingscape. I mean, how many times have we seen that? But there's something really intense about it. Some people put it in the terms of like the supernatural. Sometimes people put it in terms of like the emotional, like that it has a real melancholy or whatever. But there's this real wavering between, are these paintings very pedestrian in their content, or are they achieving something higher, some kind of more interesting enchantment? And so the intro for me of the sketches book was kind of trying to explain like how this dynamic happens in the art, trying to figure out like what about the art makes this happen. And the reason it's a book of sketches is basically that like the uninteresting story is that there was a bunch of like estate crap when my other uncle, Gus's lover, dies in 2016. There's a bunch of estate crap, and there was a long time where I had access to all the sketchbooks but didn't have access to the paintings. And the thing with the sketchbooks is that they're totally different from the paintings, like eerily different, in the sense that you would expect an artist to maybe do a lot of kind of preparing of the paintings in the sketchbook or sort of different modes of them. But instead of being urban nightscapes in the sketchbooks, we just have a ton of people mostly sleeping. It's so weird. I was like, what is going on? Like, why are there thousands of pages of people sleeping on the subway or on park benches or things like that? So that was I was like, there's something here. Nobody's seen this work because Gus just exhibited the paintings. And I was like, there's something here that actually gets us back to the paintings, maybe in an interesting way. And if there's one thing I know how to do, I know how to make a book, but I don't know how to like make an art gallery exhibit or something like that. So I was like, well, let's, work with what I'm good at. So I was like, I'm going to formulate some kind of book project. And I called it An Excess of Quiet because it was my term for this kind of binary that everybody was feeling with the work, that it felt very quiet and yet excessive. It felt really zen and kind of calm and pedestrian and also sort of intense and almost supernatural and this and that. And I think the book has this effect, the sketchbook has this effect of as you go through it, each individual sketch feels very partial and totally underdone, but all together they make this real strong mood that I just think is really powerful. So there's two connections to madness, actually. The first is just that I was dealing with, at this time, a real lived example of a reparative book project, right? Yeah. Like, here's a historical person who, for some reason, has fallen somewhere out of the archive. Let's do a reparative work. And I was reading a lot of these, but I was making one myself. And that gave me a lot of formal sense for madness, a lot of what we might call like the verisimilitude of its form. The second is kind of affective. Like, I thought this sense of an excess of quiet would be really interesting to bring to Luis. So his madness is very passive, or it seems quite passive. This isn't, this isn't that Victorian madness of the, screaming in the cell in the tower above the whatever. Like, he actually he's very private. He's very sad. You might notice that like when I read most of the poems from the book, I usually use like a deeper tone of voice because I find Luis to be a bit more here. Like I talk here, but Luis feels like a little bit more here. He feels slower than I am. He's less like spastic than I am. He's just a bit, he has a sort of melancholy and a little bit of a weight to him. So, but I wanted that weightiness, that sad passiveness to feel like it kind of would erupt in certain ways, or like it would create this really spiky environment every so often. And that was a real goal for the diaries section of Madness, where we turn away from the poetry momentarily to get a real like up close and personal with Luis. And I really was influenced by that aesthetic sense that I think my uncle had.
Well, the sketches are amazing. Like I could not page through it in one sitting because it became so overwhelming to me. you
They're
write
intense, yeah.
It is. And you write that the sketches are by turns both unsentimental and tenderhearted.
Yeah.
And you even used the word enchanted and talking about the sketches just now, but you also say of Luis that he was as much enchanted as disenchanted with the world. This is all so moving to me because you created a book called Madness that's very composed.
Totally.
And the poetry is about trying to find another world. It zooms us into the future, and he can't get there. We can't really get there, but I also know the world exists because I believe that a poet named Luis Montes-Torres exists. And he's as real as any poet I know, so maybe I've gone mad. But that is a madness I will choose. I thought we would end with one poem that is the second to last poem in the book, Attachment and Ambivalence.
Totally. So this is one of the last poems that Luis writes, and it's one of the last poems in the book. It's called Attachment and Ambivalence. And I have to just say, this was me very much trying to do my Ashbury hat, I think. Wander with me between water and water as a program we use to gently suggest a set of ramifications, two isolated owls, for the actions that led to this, to you sitting beside me, and you will cease to wince at every mention of the name. The leaf cutting the sky from the sky, at least for a moment, implies ambivalence drowned in light. A particle of an unknown element which travels a breath between us and strikes fear into a mother's heart. It is not just some fairy dust, not just the silent operations of aliens. I never made light of difference. I reduced it to lawns moving slowly, the syrup the animals wade through, the dialogue of two agents in disagreement. Forecasting by waving my wand over a pile of my bones, I say a picture is like a portrait, and that in some way I will get my mulligan. As a little courtesy, don't say you need me. Pare the rind off of that star fruit. Find an upside in calculus. Get cold in the space between your freckles. Look out the window. If I'm right to guess, you already know what I'm going to say next, and you know it is the perfect compliment.
Well, I think with your uncle's sketches with madness, ambivalence drowned in light might be a really good place to end. And I think just in general, I mean, the tone is different than some of these other fictional poets that we've talked about, and it seems so tender and reparative and open-hearted. So I just thought I'd ask if you have any other final thoughts for the listeners.
I think my final thought is that I kind of think if I were really talking about madness, I think that this is actually much more what people's madness looks like most of the time. Ambivalence drowned in light more than anything else. And that's part of why I wanted the title to be a phrase that you could say like, madness. It's got this kind of Monster Mash vibe to it. But I actually think that there's something about our madness that's a bit closer to this. A friend of mine, Cesar Magallon, who's a writer and immigration activist, once tweeted something like, somebody had tweeted, I either picked, living or, getting crushed by the world. And my friend tweeted, well, the third option is madness, but none of us are ready to talk about that, or something like that. And I thought that was so right. I think it's the option we actually all end up picking.
You can find Gabriel Ojeda-Sagué's books Madness and An Excess of Quiet here at the library, or find out more about him and his work at ojeda-sague.com. That's our show. Thank you to Gabriel for taking the time to talk with me, and thank you for listening to our 55th interview episode. Comments and feedback are always welcome and can be sent to podcast@deerfieldlibrary.org. Go to deerfieldlibrary.org/podcast to learn more about our show and find links to subscribe. You can also follow the library on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or check out our YouTube channel. Links are on our website or in the show notes. We'll be back next month. Thanks for listening.